Have you ever wondered if what you're feeling is truly love, or just a desperate attempt not to feel alone? We often enter relationships expecting them to complete us, as if the other person were the missing piece in an emotional puzzle. And maybe that's the first mistake. When we seek love not as a connection, but as an escape, the seed of desperation is already planted. Love becomes urgent, and where there's urgency, there's fear. Nietzsche once said, "We don't love the person themselves, but the pleasure they give us." But what happens when that pleasure fades? When the other person's presence no longer silences our insecurities? Most people carry a silent fantasy that true love will finally solve everything, that it will validate us, that it will bring us peace. But as Alain de Botton said, we are dangerously romantic. We imagine love should be spontaneous, easy, and intuitive, when in fact it is a skill that requires practice. And no skill is born out of desperation. There's something cruel about placing on someone else the responsibility of soothing the pain life has given us. When we see someone as a promise of happiness, we're not really seeing the person. We're seeing a function. They need to fulfill us, save us, want us. But what if they don't? The fall is devastating, because we're not just dealing with someone's absence. We're dealing with the collapse of a hope that was all we had left. Neediness isn't the problem. It's human. The problem is when it becomes a standard. When we accept any scrap of attention just to avoid facing our own silence. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star, Nietzsche said. But many people, when they feel that chaos, run. And they run into the arms of whoever promises immediate relief, even if it's only temporary. This is how love turns into despair, when it stops being a connection and becomes a form of anesthesia. When we don't love the other person, but the sense of relief they give us. And then we confuse presence with passion, attention with affection, companionship with love. And the most ironic part? That despair, instead of bringing us closer, drives us apart. Because no one can truly love someone who's begging to be saved. Love isn't about carrying the other person. It's about walking side by side. Love isn't a refuge to escape from yourself. It's a place to meet the other. Maybe the right question isn't, why am I alone? But rather, why am I looking for someone to pull me out of here? As long as love feels like an urgent need, it will be a prison disguised as freedom. But when love becomes a choice, then it can finally be a bridge, not a hole. Maybe the greatest paradox of modern love is this. In order to be loved, we abandon who we truly are. We live in a time where being authentic feels almost like an act of bravery. At the beginning of a relationship, we often don't show who we are. We show who we think the other person wants us to be. This performance, disguised as connection, creates a silent trap. The more we try to please, the less we are truly seen. And that's where frustration is born, that feeling of being alone, even when you're with someone. Jean-Paul Sartre once said, "Hell is other people," but he was referring to how the gaze of others imprisons us, how we begin to shape our identity around someone else's approval. And love, when lived under that constant gaze, stops being freedom and becomes a stage, a theater of anxiety where the fear of rejection plays the lead role. How many times have you caught yourself thinking, am I talking too much? Do I seem desperate? Will she stop talking to me if I say this? These questions aren't just insecurities. They're symptoms of a deeper kind of forgetting, the kind where you no longer know where your desire to be loved ends and your true self begins. And the great tragedy? When you forget yourself, the other person forgets you too, because what they see isn't a person. It's a character, a softened, edited version, carefully crafted not to disturb. But real love disturbs. It demands presence, not perfection. It asks for truth, not performance. Be yourself has become such a generic piece of advice, but it's one of the hardest things to do. Because to be yourself, you first have to remember who you are. And that memory is often buried under trauma, rejection, social conditioning, and of course, the fear of not being enough. It's no wonder so many relationships fall apart the moment they start to deepen. That's when the mask starts to slip, and the other person finally sees who's really there, someone full of doubts, imperfections, and insecurities. But that person is exactly who deserves to be loved. Because if it's not for who you really are, then it's not love. It's just temporary approval. Erich Fromm once wrote that love is the active concern for the life and growth of that which we love. But how can that be possible if we spend all our time hiding the most alive parts of ourselves, the most sensitive, the most contradictory, the most human. The constant attempt to be desired can make us invisible, and love, instead of healing, becomes another confirmation of our fear, that maybe, just maybe, we're unbearable as we really are. But what if, just for a moment, you let your guard down? What if you showed your mess without being afraid of looking weak? What if, instead of trying to win someone over, you simply allowed yourself to be? That's where true connection is born, not in the perfection of the character, but in shared imperfection. Loving without losing yourself is the only way to be truly loved. And only those brave enough to be who they are can experience a kind of love that doesn't need to be negotiated with every gesture. Every relationship is, at its core, a dance. But what happens when one person starts listening to a different song? That's how many relationships begin to fall apart. Not because of a lack of love, but because of too many expectations. We expect too much, too soon, with too much intensity. And without realizing it, we project an entire movie onto the other person, one where we've already written the dialogue, the gestures, even the happy ending. The problem is, the other person, this flesh and blood human being, might not even know they're in our fantasy. Fernando Pessoa once wrote, "I carry within me all the dreams of the world. But what happens when those dreams don't fit into reality? When we demand from someone something they never promised to give? Many times what we call heartbreak isn't the other person's failure. It's the failure of our own projection. We're not disappointed in who they are, but in the gap between who they are and who we wanted them to be. We create an ideal, an imaginary character, and when reality shows up, we feel lost. And that misalignment creates noise. The person is just being themselves, moving at their own pace, with their doubts, their pauses. But on the other side, there's someone anxious, waiting for quick answers, grand gestures of love, constant reassurance that everything's okay, but okay. By whose standards? That's when love turns into anxiety. Every slow reply, every unanswered message, every little detail becomes a sign that we're being rejected. Because when we carry too many expectations, every silence starts to feel like a scream. Nietzsche once warned, "Hope is the worst of evils, for it prolongs the torment of man." It's not about expecting nothing from others, but about not turning our hopes into cages, because love doesn't grow under pressure. It blooms in the space between two people who truly see each other, not who idealize each other. Imagine a dance where one person suddenly starts running while the other hesitates trying to keep up. The harmony is lost, not because someone made a mistake, but because their rhythms fell out of sync. And this happens all the time in relationships, when one person feels deeply, quickly, while the other is still learning how to feel. And the more expectations grow, the more they demand, until love becomes a burden, an emotional debt that can never be repaid. Because the other person isn't really in a relationship with you anymore, but with the invisible demands hanging over every interaction. Emotional maturity begins when we realize the other person doesn't exist to fulfill us, but to meet us. And that requires listening, patience, and rhythm. Just like in a real dance, sometimes you lead, sometimes you follow, but never alone. Love is a dance between two people who are fully present. And to make that possible, we must let go of our pre-written scripts and open ourselves to the improvisation of real life. Have you ever noticed how everything feels lighter when you simply show up? Without expecting too much, without forcing anything, just being present. It sounds simple, but maybe it's one of the most revolutionary acts in a world so obsessed with results, control, and instant responses. When we talk about loving without desperation, we're not talking about indifference. Loving lightly doesn't mean loving less. It means loving better. It means making space for the other person to exist as they are, not as you need them to be. Simone de Beauvoir once said, "To love is, above all, to wish the other well with the lightness of not possessing." But how do we cultivate that lightness in a time when love is treated like a prize, a trophy, a form of validation? The answer might lie in presence. Being present isn't just about being physically close. It's about truly listening, watching without judgment, letting the other person breathe, not responding to everything with anxiety. It's realizing that someone else's timing isn't a threat. It's an invitation to balance. A lot of people think that caring less is the key, that the secret is to be cold, detached, in control. But that's just another trap, using apathy as armor. And no armor allows for an embrace. Love doesn't need control, it needs surrender. But not the desperate kind of surrender that seeks salvation. the calm surrender of someone whole enough to share themselves with another. Viktor Frankl once wrote, "Love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of their personality. That doesn't happen when we're desperately trying to be chosen. It happens when we look at someone without filters, without rushing, without neediness disguised as passion. Loving with presence means not turning the other person into a mirror of our self-worth. It means not measuring our value by the attention we receive. It's learning that rejection doesn't define our essence, that absence doesn't erase existence. That true connection is born when there's space to be, not pressure to perform. And yes, that's hard, because it requires something many people avoid, a deep encounter with yourself. It's impossible to be present in a relationship if you don't know how to be present with yourself. If silence terrifies you, if waiting overwhelms you, if time feels like pressure, maybe the love you're searching for in someone else is the love you still need to build within. That's why loving without desperation is more than an emotional skill. It's a practice in maturity. It's the result of a journey where, little by little, we stop begging for attention and start offering presence. And believe me, few things are more attractive than someone who doesn't need to be with you, but chooses to be. Loving lightly is the art of being whole, not perfect, whole. Because when you know yourself, you respect yourself. When you respect yourself, you express yourself. And when you express yourself with authenticity, you create real bonds, not just temporary connections. So in the end, why do we turn love into desperation? Maybe because we were taught that without it, we're incomplete. Maybe because we grew up watching happy endings wrapped in promises that someone would come save us. Maybe because we confused affection with need and connection with control. But love, real love, doesn't come from urgency. It blooms from freedom. It's easy to fall into the trap of turning someone else into a remedy, a solution, an escape. But no healthy relationship is built on the foundation of emotional dependency. Desperation in love says more about our own wounds than about the other person. It shows us where we haven't healed yet, where we still hope someone else will fill us, where we still don't feel like enough on our own. To love, at its core, is an invitation to presence, to listening, to lightness, to truth. And no, that doesn't mean not feeling deeply. It means feeling with awareness. It means being with another not to escape yourself, but to find yourself. As Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, love consists in this, that two solitudes protect, touch, and greet each other. The kind of love that doesn't lead to despair is the love that doesn't demand. It offers. It doesn't invade. It welcomes. It doesn't correct. It understands. And most importantly, it doesn't pull us away from who we are. It reminds us. So if you're going to love, let it be with lightness, with open eyes, with a present soul, because only then does love stop being desperation and become freedom. While I was writing this script, I remembered a very specific moment. A night when I was alone in my room after yet another failed attempt at connection, and I found myself wondering, what's wrong with me? That feeling of emptiness, of not being enough, was consuming me. I kept rereading messages, trying to figure out where I went wrong, rehearsing 1,000 different versions of myself that might be more acceptable. And right there, between silence and deep sighs, I realized something. I was so focused on being chosen that I had forgotten to choose myself. Maybe you felt that too. Maybe you're feeling it right now. If so, I just want to tell you one thing. You're not alone. This video is for you, for us, for everyone who, at some point, confused love with approval, presence with instant replies, and affection with validation. Now I want to offer you something that's not for everyone, but it is for you, because you've made it this far, searching for deeper answers about who you are and where your life is headed. I've created something more than just a book. I've built a map for the soul, a manual that brings together science, philosophy, and critical thinking to help you break free from mental patterns, question your identity, and rebuild yourself from the ground up. This isn't an e-book full of feel-good quotes. It's a guide for those who can no longer stand living on autopilot. If you feel that something inside you is calling for change, growth, clarity, then this is your moment. Click the pinned comment and get instant access to the Self-Transformation Manual. Don't read it out of curiosity. Read it because your life depends on it. And if you choose to begin this journey, you won't be the same by the end of the road. And if you've made it this far, thank you, truly, for giving love the time to be reflected on, for allowing this conversation to reach you. Now, before you go, I'm going to break the fourth wall for a second. If you enjoyed this video, do that sacred ritual, like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Or if you're feeling poetic, think of it as a non-desperate gesture of affection. Oh, and those videos right here on the side? I'm not going to tell you what they're about, but I can promise you this. They'll move you, and maybe they'll make you rethink things you thought you already understood. See you there.